Once the boss reaches 10% HP, he will submerge one last time into his platform, and Phase 4 will begin. Fixated players will kite the meteors toward the front of the room, where the NPCs are, while the rest of the raid prepares to unleash on the boss. Players cannot begin Phase 4 on the lava portion of the platform, or they'll risk falling through the world. Instead, gather on the edge to be ready to attack Rag as soon as he re-emerges. Meteors will be frozen during the transition, but can still be punted away. Move them as far to the front of the room as possible while this occurs. Ragnaros will begin Phase 4 by climbing out of his pool just before it solidifies. The now solid lava can be walked on and almost doubles the space for the raid. This phase is about survival, execution, and DPS. Positioning is dynamic depending on where different spells spawn throughout the phase, but there is one basic formation that the raid needs to become familiar with. Shortly into this phase and throughout the rest of the fight, the raid will need to make its way to small blue void zones called Breaths of Frost. These will spawn in random locations, and the raid must stack inside the area to avoid taking damage from superheated. This is not as easy as it sounds, however. Players will need to stack in 3 evenly spaced groups of 7 to 8 players each in 3 corners of the circular Breath of Frost. We call this the Flying V. Now that I think of it, you're stationary while in the breath, and the Flying V moves, so yeah, we definitely aren't raid led by Emilio Estevez. Let's call this the Triforce. It's extremely important that anytime the raid is within the Breath of Frost, they maintain the Triforce formation. Failing to do this will risk spawning a geyser, doing heavy fire damage to all players, knocking them back, and more importantly, destroying the breath. While players are standing in the breath, the meteor will still require kiting. Targeted players must safely and carefully run out of the group and kite the meteor away from the breath. Assign 2 players in the breath to focus on punting meteors. Players returning from kiting a meteor must take exceptional care to move carefully back into the proper group. Meteors will be destroyed during this phase, but that will be covered in a moment. Shortly after the first breath spawns, a blue water bubble known as Deluge will spawn in a random location. 3 assigned players will interact with the Deluge to gain its buff. These 3 players will become immune to Dread Flame and superheated damage, and will be able to extinguish Dread Flames by running over them. Dread Flame is cast by Ragnaros every few seconds, increasing in frequency as the phase goes on. It creates multiple patches of fire at random locations on the platform. It will be up to the Deluge players throughout the fight to run around and very quickly put out as much Dread Flame as possible. Eventually, it will become impossible to keep up with all the Dread Flame that goes out, so it's important not to fall behind too early. Start by splitting the raid into 3 sections and assigning 1 Deluge player to each part. Oftentimes, Deluge players will need to properly prioritize different areas. For example, Dread Flames close to breaths are more important than Dread Flames in the middle of nowhere. If a Dread Flame spawns under the breath or under a group in the breath, call for the nearby players to move away before running in to clear it. This will lower the chances of spawning a geyser in the area. Throughout the phase, the NPCs will occasionally spawn in trapping roots in random locations. Kiting Ragnaros into these will stun him for 10 seconds and increase the damage taken for a short duration. This may seem like a tempting offer the moment the roots appear, but this stun should be saved to counter Rag's Empower Sulfuras ability. Throughout the phase, he will empower Sulfuras, causing each melee swing to kill the raid. This spell has a lengthy cast time and lasts only 5 seconds. During the cast, the tank will need to kite Ragnaros through the entrapping roots so that the boss is stunned during the Empower Sulfuras buff. This will prevent him from hitting the tank and keep his buff from destroying the raid. During this phase, the raid will also want to kill off any remaining meteors. Normally, the meteors cannot be killed because of their damage reduction buff, but if a meteor is kited into a Breath of Frost, it will be frozen and take increased damage for 10 seconds. Unfortunately, this will also destroy the breath, so the raid must wait for an extra one before doing this. Alright, that's a lot of information to take in. Let's break this down step by step real quick. Phase 3 ends. Kite and punt the meteors toward the NPCs at the front of the platform. Ragnaros emerges and the raid begins taking superheated stacks. The first Breath of Frost spawns and the raid goes into Triforce positioning. Deluge spawns and the 3 assigned players use it to begin putting out Dread Flames. trap spawns and the tank must kite Rag to it for Empower Sulfuras. The second breath spawns and a meteor is kited into it to be killed. The third breath spawns as the first one despawns and the raid moves to this new one. A second trap spawns and Rag must be kited into it. When the fourth breath spawns, kite the second meteor into it and kill it off. This is the basic order of events and priorities throughout the phase. Once both meteors have been killed, the fight becomes about moving to new breaths, kiting the boss into traps, and staying ahead on Dreadflame. Keep in mind these three concepts. The first thing that every player needs to concern themselves with is properly positioning themselves in the breath and being comfortable running in and out of their groups without causing a geyser. After that, every player needs to understand how to properly kite meteors, not only out of the group, but into breaths quickly if needed. It is a good idea to use a damage reduction cooldown if leaving the Breath of Frost is necessary. If the whole raid is leaving the breath, use a Stampeding Roar or any other movement buffs to quickly get to the next and out of Superheated. Deluge players must be able to efficiently and quickly decide which Dreadflames are worth chasing and putting out, and which ones must be ignored. They also need to communicate when groups must move away from the breath so they can clear nearby Dreadflame. Tanks need to be able to make their way to traps and successfully kite Rag into them. Oftentimes, traps will be deep in fields of Dreadflame, and the tank must use cooldowns, soak up heals, and pray their way through the fire in order to get the boss trapped. Movement spells like Heroic Leap and Leap of Faith can be very useful for these situations. As long as each player remembers their job and keeps a level head, the boss will fall. It sounds like a lot is going on, and that's because there is. Think of it one piece at a time and it all comes together though. Each player has a different and unique responsibility, and more than any other fight in the game's history, focus is key to success. There is extremely little room for error in this fight, so players must concentrate at all times during all phases. That said, getting to phase 4 is honestly the easy part of the encounter. Each phase is a new benchmark. Try to look at the progress you are making instead of the progress you are not. Reaching a new phase should be thought of as reaching a new plateau. Finally, don't let yourself get burned out on this encounter. It will take quite a while to down this boss, and no amount of slamming your head against it will change that. Go for short periods of highly focused raiding instead of long nights of poor and draining attempts. If you found this guide helpful or enjoyable, please bookmark us at learntoraid.com, subscribe to us on YouTube, JustinTV, and BlipTV, and follow us on Twitter. Good luck, and we'll see you at Deathwing's door.
I wasn't feeling so good. I just didn't feel like playing anymore. So I went home, and I got all comfy and cozy and all scrunched up in front of my phonograph.